Welcome to the Stories in EDU podcast, the show where we talk with real educators and hear their powerful impact. Their stories will grab you, inspire you, and show you the reach of the work we do. And now, the Bretzman Group presents your hosts, Josh Gauthier and Mandy Taylor.
Welcome back to the Stories in EDU podcast, the podcast where we get to hear great stories from educators all across the country and the world. And as we get deeper into the school year here, it's definitely interesting to see how we all just take on the routine. Mandy, you've changed your routine quite a bit over the last 2 years after having been a classroom teacher for so long and then instructional coach, and now you're up at the district level. Mm-hmm. What would you say is the one thing that stays the same from your perspective?
I think the one thing that stays the same is how hard classroom teachers work. When I was a classroom teacher, I worked so hard. Like I was physically exhausted, I was emotionally exhausted, I was mentally exhausted. And I just feel like classroom teachers work so hard. As an instructional coach, I got to see that from a different perspective. I got to see it from that building perspective, and I saw how hard kindergarten teachers worked and how hard fifth grade teachers worked, and how everybody's working hard on different things, but that the classroom teacher is still the one that takes on the brunt of everyone's new initiative, everyone's ideas, everyone's problem with an email or a grade or and I think now even at the district level, I see it even compounded. My very favorite days are the days that I get to be in classrooms and work with kids and teachers. But even then, I'm there typically for an hour at most, and then I leave and I have maybe an adult conversation, or I go to a meeting, or I get to go grab a drink. Grab like a soda or a coffee, like hang on.
Good save.
On my way to my next meeting or something like that. And every once in a while, I'm just like, I get to have this little mental break during the day, and it's a 10-minute break on my way from this campus to this campus, but it's a break that a classroom teacher doesn't get. And I think that that's the constant, is just my reverence for classroom teachers. I see it from my kids' perspective, my own personal children, how hard their teachers work, the communication I get from them, the things that the kids tell me happen in their class. Like, I just see it from every aspect.
Absolutely. Well, I'm excited that we have a classroom teacher on tonight to tell stories with us. We have Mr. David Abdel. We're going to bring him on the podcast right now. And we are excited to have him. David, welcome to Stories in EDU.
Hi.
Glad to be here.
All right.
I'm so excited, Josh, because this is actually a teacher that is from my district
Nice.
at one of our high schools. And I actually have only ever met him through Twitter. And actually, this is our first face-to-face meeting, which is not even really that, but it's nice to meet you in real fake life, and I'm just excited to kind of talk to you.
Yeah, that's cool. It kind of reminds me of Malcolm Gladwell. I think it was Malcolm Gladwell, and talking about how organizations, once they get past 250 people, are too big because you can no longer know everybody and you lose connections. And what better sign of that than you have to meet awesome talent in your district because on Twitter because it's too big and you can't see them.
Right, exactly.
So David, tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do.
David Abdel. Most people call me Abdel for short. So I teach 11th grade AP US History and 10th grade World History blended learning at Lehman High School in Kyle, Texas. Not a native Texan, so don't hold that against me. Born and raised in Jersey City, which is just outside of Manhattan. I moved to Texas about 14 years ago. I used to do corporate data analysis, and I moved down for work And I lived in San Antonio and just outside of San Antonio for a little bit, and moved up to Brooklyn, came back to Texas because I fell in love with it. And fortunately, I got to move to Austin. And then I was working from home for a while, and eventually I just decided that what I was doing was not making a difference. And I had wanted to teach a long time ago, but I got into a job that paid significantly more. And then when I realized that the money didn't matter anymore, I said it was time to get into teaching. And 3 years ago, I dove headfirst in, and I cannot think of a day that I did not wake up absolutely in love with my life since I started teaching.
That is,
I love that quote.
not only really cool, but very invigorating for, I think, anybody that's listening that has been in teaching a while, and to hear that reminder of why we did this to make a difference, I think is really cool. And I also think that you would probably love to talk spreadsheets sometime. Corporate data analysis, I'm sure you used a couple spreadsheets, right?
There's no going, but once it's in your bones, it's funny because, you have, we have administrators, and the administrator is a people person, or this administrator is a data person. And I'm like, oh, okay, a data person. Like, let's get down.
This is like my worst nightmare right now, like my absolute worst nightmare. Coming from an elementary background, the spreadsheet is like the bane of my existence.
Oh my
and
goodness.
I'm supposed to be really good at it. I just can't. I can't get behind that medium.
We can get all excited if we start talking about spreadsheets, which we might do with our lightning round. So David, new to the podcast. I don't know if you've heard an episode before, but we have always included at the end sometimes, we've been doing it at the beginning recently, a card from the Bretzman Group Personalized PD Game of Stories. And it's just a little prompt. There's 52 of them in the deck. You can grab them off Amazon. And they're great for discussions among your staff. So I picked a card for tonight that seems apt to roll off a spreadsheet discussion.
Awesome.
It says, share an app, add-on, or extension. Tell a story about your favorite apps, add-ons, or extensions, and explain how you use them. How does what you use make teaching and learning better? Which have you heard about that you want to try next? Or maybe you should just get together a group for Appy Hour.
Happy hour.
All right. So what we are going to do, Mr. Abdel, is we are going to pull up a 1-minute timer for Mandy and then us two.
They have to cut me off.
This is easy. Okay, so if anybody is listening and you're an educator, the best add-on you can possibly use is Pear Deck. I am absolutely in love with the Pear Deck add-on. So if you use Google Slides, which you should definitely be using rather than Microsoft PowerPoint, the Pear Deck add-on allows you to embed checks for understanding within your slides. Not only that, but it's super interactive for students. So students log on. It's very much like Nearpod, if you're familiar with that. But the embedded questions that you could put in, you can create your own. You can create multiple choices. You can create where the students draw. They can have open-ended questions. You can put images onto your slides, and the students can draw all over them. It's an excellent way to make sure that as you're going along, if you are having one of those stand and deliver kind of days, that you can make sure are long, and you can check their answers in real time and post them to the screen if you have a projector. So if they're drawing something and you find something particularly funny to maybe roast the kids on, feel free to put it up on the board for a good laugh.
Excellent. Thank you. I love Pear Deck. We just got a subscription to that at one of my schools this year, and a lot of teachers starting to use it. Super cool. Glad you shared about that. All right, Mandy, you are up.
All right. So I'm going to pick app for 400. The app that I have gotten into, I feel like that's really made a difference, is Voxer. I don't use it with kids, but I use it as a PD tool. So I kind of feel like Voxer is where I take some of my Twitter conversations to the next level. So it's just basically a CB app, like a walkie-talkie, so I can listen to it in my car. We've done book studies with Voxer. We've done, I've been part of some after hours discussions, like we'll post something in a Twitter chat and then we'll take it to the Voxer app afterwards for people that really like to just hear people and talk. It's asynchronous, so I can kind of join in and listen when I want to, and then I don't feel like I'm impacting anybody if I don't get around to it for a couple of days. I I like it as long as I mute my notifications, because that will make you crazy. But other than that, highly recommend.
All right. So inspired by our little spreadsheet chat just a bit ago, I want to talk about this time. Not too long ago, a couple of weeks at the time of recording, that I was working with a colleague who's very new to a tech coach position. And at the elementary level, they do a lot of spreadsheets that have data on them, like test scores or benchmarks that they reached. And so teachers wanted to be able to look at this benchmark thing, I think, for math, and be able to just see per teacher what students were not meeting the benchmark so that they could do interventions. And so we concocted this beautiful formula that allowed all the teachers to see their students that didn't meet the benchmark on one sheet, and it had a simple drop down where you just switched the month and it automatically changed, so it went to the next row that was on the main spreadsheet, and the teachers that are going to use it don't have to do anything but click the drop down, and now the tech coach doesn't have to do anything again either. It's all done now.
Awesome.
Me, I love spreadsheets. All right. David and I are going to do the after chat about spreadsheets so that we don't have to make everybody else listen to that.
I leave before that.
All right. So, David, you've been a teacher, you said, for 3 years now?
This is my third year right now.
Okay. So I am sure that you remember every single day of teaching like we all do. Maybe not, but in that amount of time, there must be one day or maybe one lesson that's really stood out to you. Is that the case? Do you have one you can take us inside?
Yeah. It was my first year, and I was really trying to kind of rock the boat and dive in and try that have been different. So I was looking online, and we were about to cover the French Revolution, and when it comes to Renaissance, Reformation, and anything related to France, I kind of get very giddy. And so I wanted
Who doesn't, right?
go to. Why worry about battles when you can learn about religious enlightenment? Find a way to ensure that these students understood the grasp of just how angry and hungry someone needs to be to try and overthrow a centuries-old monarchy. And so I crafted this lesson where I broke the class down into 3 estates, just like the 3 French estates. And so I had a group of students who sat directly at my desk who were supposed to be the first estate, and I showered them with baked goods and snacks and candy and food, and we kind of just hung out every day for 3 or 4 days at my desk and talked about life and what was going on. And then I had another group who represented the second estate, where they were a little bit larger of a group. So initially the first estate was 3 or 4 students. The second estate made up about maybe 7 or 8. And those students kind of sat there, and they had a little bit of space to themselves. They had some restrictions based on whether or not they were allowed to leave class and how much work they had to do. But the main group was about the other half of the class, and I crammed all their desks together to make it as uncomfortable as possible. Giving them extra homework every day. I told them that they weren't allowed to leave the class for any reason, that if they stood up for any reason, I was going to take points off their test. We just made this ridiculous number of rules in the class, and I had everyone vote on it. But I told the students at my desk that they had to vote however I voted, because I was the king and they needed to listen. And if they didn't vote the way I wanted, they'd be moved to one of the other sides of the room. So they very much enjoyed their baked goods and so they dared not vote against me. And it was interesting to see how quickly the students who were on the side of the room that were being, I guess, educationally abused, how they got very upset very quickly, and how the people who were at my desk did not necessarily care because they were being fed every day and treated quite well. And so after a few days of this and a few angry, parent phone calls and emails and explanations being given to anyone who would listen, we finally, on the last day of the week, kind of had a big celebration where I explained, okay, this is, the point of all this. And I mean, you talk about an impact. That we had a test on that unit, and it was the highest score of the year. I mean, they completely understood the lesson. But more importantly than just the names and dates, they understood the nuance and the context of the history because they sort of lived it. And it's hard to get a student to live the French Revolution. But in this sense, they understood like, oh, these people must have been so angry that they were being treated unfairly and so angry, that they were hungry. And, a kid could have a full belly, but if he sees somebody else eating pizza and cookies, he immediately becomes starving. Mm-hmm. So they understood the hunger aspect of it. And I still have those students are now seniors, and I have them coming back to my class all the time, and they're asking me, they're like, hey, are you gonna do the French Revolution thing again? I think I'm gonna bring it back, maybe every other year so it doesn't become too common. And they're like, oh, I gotta find a way to get back into your class for that. Like maybe I can still remember all this stuff and that stuff and how much you do. And it got to the point where it was I was never concerned about my safety, but I did park on the other side of the building. Just in case anything like that. It was an impactful lesson. And I think the more you can make a lesson that has that kind of impact and really drive the point home, the better off it is. I mean, they had no choice but to interact with the material in that regard. And I'll never forget it because I think it was the first lesson of the year where I was like, oh, this is what educating is. It's not just, making kids write down definitions and hope they remember them. This is the point, is to get them involved, get them really feeling the material, especially from social studies. A lot of people don't initially care for social studies education from a student perspective. History is never on the top of things. Or you'll get kids that are like, oh, I'm not good at history. And I always say, well, it's not something to be good at. You just need to be taught the right way. You need someone to explain why you're learning this and give you some context. It's not, there's nothing to solve. It's not a math problem, so you can't not. You just need to be engaged. And I found a way to engage the students. And from then I was just like, okay, this is my mission, is to take every piece of content and say, how do I engage these kids in that way? And it's every year I'm coming up with new stuff.
Yeah. And that's the fun part about it too. I know I taught, my experience has all been in elementary, but I taught first grade for 12 years. And that was one of the things, is just that idea of context. And for little ones, we know how crucial that context is to everything, to their learning about, their vocabulary and, every little thing they're learning through our read alouds and through everything. We're trying to build context so that they can attach the new content they learn to something that they can, reference. And I think when I have seen my own personal children the most disengaged from content is because they don't have a connection with it. They don't understand why it's important, or they don't, feel that, that reason, why, even we hear kids like, why do I have to learn this and stuff? And I really don't think that's a defiant question. It's a question that they're really genuinely needing to have answered. Why is this relevant to my actual life? And if I, as an adult, I don't want to spend time learning things that I don't feel like are applicable to me. If you can show me why a spreadsheet is going to help make my life better, then I'll gladly engage in a conversation about it. But
give me 5 minutes.
I mean, seriously, let's be real. But but I have to get it. I have to understand it. And I think that, like you said, those connections to that are really, to that content are really important. I remember when I was in middle school, I went to Dahlstrom in our district, and my 8th grade teacher, we came in one day and he was like, hey, I have a couple of Dr. Peppers that I had left over from last night, this party, and there were like 4 cans of Dr. Pepper. And he's like, if anybody has, I'll just auction them off right now if anybody wants them. And people were paying like $5 that they just had money for these Dr. Peppers. And people were mad, and then, all this stuff. And then finally he's like, oh, wait, I found some more. And, so the people that had paid $5 for one, like it was getting down. And then it was this whole big thing, and it was his intro to supply and demand. But I will always remember that lesson because he played it off as just this thing that was happening. And then later throughout the year, we were doing something, and he had this kid, he took this kid and like started searching his backpack, and the whole thing, the kid ran out and they had worked together on it, and it was about like illegal search and seizure or something. And but every little thing he tried to find these ways to kind of hook us into what he was going to teach it. And I remember those, like it was the story. It was like the connection to why learning about this is important. So I can completely understand why the kids were so fascinated by that lesson, and they will remember it.
Yeah, one of the big tenets that I give them in the beginning of the year is I believe in uncomfortability. And I preach that around. I'm like, I need y'all to find a way to be okay being uncomfortable. So it's a running thing in my class. I've now moved to flexible seating, so it's a lot easier now. But when I just had desks, I would change the complete outline of the class with the desk every single day. So every single day they'd be in a completely different format, different seating chart. Sometimes they'd be allowed to sit wherever they wanted. And they always ask, they're like, why do you take the time to do this every day? I'm like, I want them walking through that door not knowing what to expect. I want them wondering, what are we going to be doing today? And it starts with, how are we going to be sitting? Like, how is he going to have it done today? And even now, when we did that get to know me that first 2 days kind of thing, I show my students a video of myself skydiving. And I intro it, and I'm like, do you know what this is? And they're like, oh, you're skydiving. And I was like, yeah, I have a debilitating fear of heights. Like, it's bad. And I told myself, maybe if I go skydiving, I can break this fear. And then, I tell them I had to get uncomfortable with, it's the most uncomfortable I've ever been, but I'm gonna do it. And then they always ask, they say, so are you still afraid of heights and flying? I'm like, oh yeah, it's even worse now, because now I know it's fall out of a plane. Had the adverse effect, but getting to that point with, being uncomfortable enough and coming to grips with that. And I tell them, like, I'm going to make you very uncomfortable this year. I'm going to have you writing more than you're probably used to. I'm going to have you working in groups. I'm going to have you speaking in front of people. I'm going to have you working with technology. I am going to keep you on your toes, because if you can figure out at a young age how to adapt, I think that's a 21st century skill. Problem solving, adaptation, creativity. This is the skills that the new workplace is looking for. We don't work in factories anymore, so we don't need people that can just run. We need dynamic, critical thinkers. So I try to bring that into the classroom as much as possible.
That's an awesome way to look at it. And I love the story about skydiving, mainly because I don't think I would ever do that. I don't think I have a fear of heights. That certainly wouldn't be the route I'd go to get over that. I might just go sit up like on the fourth level of a baseball game. That's about good enough for me. But that's really cool. And I like how that idea of being uncomfortable, but not so much like, I don't want you to not be comfortable in my class, but I want you to be able to adapt. And I think that's a kind of a cool little thing to think about as teachers, is how can we make our classes places where students need to adapt to different situations. I also think the benefit of that, and maybe you can tell us kind of how that's meted out, is if you don't let students fall into a routine, you probably don't have a lot of behavior issues, because I think that's part of it, is students know what to expect every day, and it just gets harder to focus. Would you agree?
I do, and that's part of the reason why I do the desk thing. And now, to be transparent, I now have couches in my room. I have very few desks, but it's mainly 2-seat, love seat couches that I get to.
We had couches at one point at one of my schools, and then we had a lice thing going around. So we don't have couches or bean bags at that school anymore. But okay. I'm glad that it's still working for you.
But no, that's part of it, is that I realized is when kids come in and they sit in, row B, seat 4, they're going to develop habits. They know the people that are around them. They know what they're going to be doing that day, because it happens the same thing every day, especially with the teacher. If the teacher's you're going to sit in that seat and the teacher's going to stand in front and talk for 40 minutes. You develop a habit. It's a study habit. You develop a personality habit, and essentially you can develop behavioral habits. And part of the getting uncomfortable and always changing things is I don't want those habits to form. I want people coming in every day and they don't know who they're going to be around. They don't know if they're going to have to speak in public. They don't know if they're going to have to write quietly. So I don't get those behavioral issues. One, I try to keep the class as engaging as possible, and if they're engaged, they're not going to act out. But also because those bad habits never form. It's when you sit around all of your friends and you start to, gab to this guy and, mess around with this girl, that those things come up. But in that dynamic situation where every day it's different, they never get that comfortability of having those habits form. And it's done wonders. I very rarely do I have a discipline issue. If I do, and I pull the student aside, it's 9 times out of 10, it's going to be because something happened and they had an issue that day. So it's not that they're acting out because it's, they want to be bad. It's because they're having a bad day. And then I can say, all right, how do we fix it? And just bring that positivity in. So I don't have the behavioral issues ever since I started this.
That's great. And I just love your perspective on things. And that's great. And I'm glad that you chose teaching. I'm glad that you decided you want to do more, because I can tell that we're definitely, as educators, benefiting from having you. So thank you for making that decision, because I know it's a tough one to make as a student or an adult, to want to go into teaching with all of the odds stacked against you. So I applaud you for that. One last thing that we were talking about before we got on. So you mentioned that you're a pretty big Mets fan. Do you have any cool experiences that you got to do with the Mets?
Yeah, so in 2015, they were fortunate enough to have sold their soul to some kind of dark wizard, and they made the World Series. And I knew that, I'm old enough to vaguely remember '86 and then 2000 when we played the Yankees. But it had been a while, so I recognized, my team was going to the World Series. This might be the last time that it ever happens. So I needed to check the bucket list. And I ended up going to the only game that they won. They lost that series to the Royals 4-1. The Royals were built to specifically beat the Mets pitching staff. I went to that game, and it was a great weekend because it was the night before Halloween was the game, and we won that game. It was the only one that we won. And then the next morning, Halloween morning, I woke up and flew to New Orleans, and I watched the Giants play the Saints. I'm also a diehard Giants fan.
Wow.
And that game was like 52-48. It was this ridiculous game. And I happened to, I was in New Orleans watching this game for Halloween. It was one of the best weekends of my life. Both my teams lost, but that's the way it goes. I coached JV baseball for our school last year. So I'm still trying as best I can to stay involved with the game. I love it. I had to stop. I have a lot on my plate this year. I'm coaching 2 UIL teams. I'm also the social studies department chair, and I sponsor 2 clubs. So
going back to the classroom teacher, the respect for the classroom teacher, Josh, going back to my intro, that's what I'm saying. Like, not just preps and everything else, but
yep, it's all the stuff. Yeah. Well, I hope to chat more in the future about baseball and all of those things and how your classroom is going. I'm super excited to see the other great stuff that you do as you continue your career in teaching, and I hope you and Mandy get to meet in person.
Yeah. We should grab lunch.
Sounds awesome. I'll just show up in your, now that I'm this district literacy whatever, my kids are terrified that I'm going to walk into their classrooms, mostly because I've said, you do know that I can walk into your classroom at any time. So you just never know when I might just show up in your room.
Excellent. So David, is there anything you want to share before you go? Anywhere people can reach out if they want to learn more about the stuff that you do?
Yeah, I would say if you're on Twitter, feel free to send me a message or follow me. It's at Mr. Abdel LHS. So that's ABDEL, and then LHS is the school that I teach at. Or feel free, you can find my contact information on there. Feel free to reach out. Like I said, I teach AP US History and blended learning. So if anyone's familiar with blended learning, I would love to trade ideas because I'm always looking for new stuff. I would encourage any teacher, if you've been doing it for a year or 20 years, just try to do new things. There's no absolutely correct way to do it, and never fall out of love with what you do. I can't stress enough, it's it's never about the income, it's about the outcome. And if we just focus on that and we dedicate ourselves to our students, it's such an old adage, but I've never worked a day in my life since I started teaching. I love it.
Super cool. All right. Well, Mandy and I are going to wrap up here. We really appreciate you taking some time to share stories, and we hope to catch up soon.
Have a good day, y'all.
Thank
Bye.
you. All right. Well, what a great storyteller he is. I have to imagine that his classroom is a fun place for kids to be.
Yeah, and it's funny. I did a Twitter training in our district. I've done it a couple of different times over the last couple of years. And one of the things I've talked about is how different campuses, how it's just that medium is helping teachers connect, across the district and stuff like that. But it's funny, I've noticed that one of the reasons I reached out to him in the first place about being on the podcast is I've noticed his interactions with students on Twitter, and he'll say something or he'll post a quote. He has quotes, I guess, that he posts on the board each day, and he'll tweet pictures of what the quote is of the day, and the kids will respond to them on Twitter and things like that. And it's been really fun to see the way that those relationships are forged, even just through social media. So it's been really exciting, and I think I will just have to show up one day and take a picture for my own self, just that, hey, look at what's going on in our district. I'm so proud of all of our teachers.
Well, make sure and post that when it happens, because us at Stories EDU would love to see these connections take place. And if you're out there listening to our podcast right now, we'd love to chat with you too and share some stories. It's a great time. We love sharing before the podcast, sometimes after the podcast, and obviously during the podcast, as we have this oral history of our profession that we love so much and is so important. So thank you for listening. We hope to have you tell your stories on here someday. But if not, just continue to listen, subscribe on iTunes. You check us out on YouTube, Google Play, Stitcher, wherever you hear stuff. Maybe you can make a mixtape. I don't know if that's even a thing anymore. But please do reach out to Mandy at Mandy M. Taylor or myself at Mr. Chief Fact of the Day. And we'd be happy to talk with you more about being on the podcast. So thanks for listening. And until next time, we will see you then.
Thank you for tuning in to the Stories in EDU podcast. Please be sure to subscribe and leave us a review. Until next time, thanks again.